Right, good morning again. Hope everyone's doing well. God, my head hurts. Right, so this is being recorded, bear in mind, after my previous video, which is basically talking about my inner demons. So if I sound like I'm a little low right now, that's why. I will try to pick it up a bit, but obviously, speaking about my inner demons and what have you, it's done a lot of damage to me mentally, so please bear that in mind. But we will continue with chapter 3.5, I believe we got up to, which is 21st Century Elitism. In The New Elites 2000, former MP George Walden describes as an oligarchy the elites who run Britain. Walden went to Cambridge University and Moscow University and was then a diplomat. As a diplomat, he attended the universities of Hong Kong, ENA Paris, and Harvard. For 10 years after leaving the Houses of Commons, or maybe I was right first time, he was a journalist. His books are published by the mainstream publishers. Thus, as he has all the qualifications of the oligarchy, even if he does not think so. His daughter is married to journalist Piers Morgan. Yes, that con man. She went to the Westminster Private School, then Cambridge University, and became a novelist after 3 years as a journalist. The oligarchy apples never fall far from the tree. I'm having struggles. I'm nearly having a stroke already. I'm having trouble trying to read today. Fucking hell. The 2006 edition of The New Elites features a photograph of con-socialist Lord David the Conman Cameron on the cover, above a recommendation by Britain's preeminent politics commentator, you have to read it, Andrew Marr. Daily Telegraph. As you can imagine, a book by a former MP recommended by a journalist and a TV presenter isn't going to be a book that challenges the oligarchy in any significant way. The book does at least discuss briefly the same political philosophers Burnham discussed in the Machiavellians, Pareto, Mosca, and Michaels. Walden does recognise that modern elites disguise their democratic elitism by pretending to share the culture and concerns of the masses. Elites are seen as undemocratic, and it would be surprising if they were to show their hand as openly as in the past, assuming, that is, that they know who they are and are conscious of their power. Anyone aspiring to a position of dominance in today's society would be inclined to give the appearance of doing the very opposite by wearing the masses' clothes, affect their accents, hum the masses' tunes, and sympathise with their daily concerns. Remember the story from Boris Johnson, announced to a TV audience at the Con-Socialist Party conference, how Bojo and Lord David Cameron had been dancing Gangnam style. Fucking hell, were they really? Just, no, I can't think of it like that. Oh, God. Anyway, Alexander Boris de Pfeffel Johnson went to Eton School and Oxford University and was then a journalist for the upmarket Telegraph and Spectator. Lord David Cameron, I love the Lord in air quotes, also went to Eton and Oxford, where so many other future MPs he studied philosophy, politics and economics, or like so many other future employees. They were both chums at Oxford, along with other chums who went on to top jobs in Britain. It's curious that Lord Cameron didn't sue the people who alleged that as a student, Lord Cameron stuck his thing in the mouth of a dead pig. And I'm sure people already know what I'm talking about here, considering how quickly I shut up there. Anyway, perhaps Lord Cameron's chums in the oligarchy told him that this is the kind of thing that the commoners do, so he shouldn't dispute these allegations, because then the commoners will believe Lord Cameron is one of the ordinary people. Oh, that's sickening. It's clear that the oligarchy will disguise their elite connections to pretend to the public that the powerful few who marched the country into the invasions and wars of commoners or are commoners like the rest of us. Cameron was PM when his government spent nearly 10 million telling the public to vote for Remain in the Brexit referendum. When Cameron discovered that the public narrowly didn't do what he wanted, he resigned, but was recently brought back into power as Lord Cameron, apparently to help to march the West into war with Russia. Should the oligarchy get this war, it won't be Lord Cameron's descendants who are dying on the front line. How can anyone be so blind to the oligarchy in a country where a failed politician is suddenly converted into an unelected lord, and then appointed as the foreign minister to foment a war in which the masses will be marched off to die? Strange that university chums Johnson and Cameron should both have been so prominent in promoting war between Ukraine and Russia. Did you ever see either of them urge a diplomatic settlement? Fundamentally, Walden has little to offer as an analysis of the oligarchy. It seems some members of the oligarchy are unwilling to recognise their own position in the oligarchy, ironically a point Walden himself makes in the above paragraph. Nevertheless, what his book shows is that the oligarchy are aware of the criticism since the end of the 19th century by Robert Michaels, James Burnham, etc., of the anti-democratic nature of liberal democracy. And yet the politicians, academics, and the media ensure that this lack of democracy is not a topic on which the electorate is asked to focus. Instead, the electorate is distracted by baubles, whilst the oligarchy laugh amongst themselves about how stupid the electorate are. Bread and circuses. Those ordinary people who see through the puppet theatre of liberal democracy are then dismissed either as far-right or conspiracy theorists by the mercenaries of the oligarchy. In 2007, Peter Oborne, former political editor of the right wing, The Spectator magazine, wrote a book entitled The Triumph of the Political Class. He argues that there is no real difference between the political parties. They are just a group of inhuman, grasping, entitled Machiavellians, simply competing against each other for fame and power with no regard for the public. The political class has won its battle to control Britain. The civil service, Parliament, the political parties, the judiciary, the intelligence services, or in some cases the lack thereof, and the media have all been captured or compromised. Excuse me. Oborne dates this rise to the appearance of New Labour and their electoral success in 1997. Having seen what, I'm not calling him sir, fuck that. Having seen what Tony the war criminal Blair and Baron Peter Mandelson and Alistair Campbell achieved with New Labour, the Con-Socialist Party just followed suit. The Con-Socialists used computer technology to identify just a tiny sliver of swing voters in marginal seats, then devoted massive efforts to persuade those voters to vote for their specific party. But later, New Labour just adopted similar technology. Politicians started to do televised meetings with the voters. These meet and greets would be stage managed with not a real voter in the room, just party lackeys pretending to be typical voters, and only tame journalists in attendance. This goes on to this day, but would stop immediately if the media told the public how fake these televised meetings are. But the media play along, laughing to themselves about how gullible the public are. Again, bread and circuses. Oborne's analysis isn't really adequate. He only sees the political corruption of the decade before he wrote the book. Throughout the 20th century, Oborne thinks Britain had robust representative democracy, which is a naive position given the views expressed by Jack London, Robert Michaels, James Burnham, and others. As we saw earlier with Mackenzie's analysis of how the Labour Party and the Con-Socialist Party in Britain work, British commentators from the 1950s to the 1990s were aware that Michael's bleak but realistic analysis applied in a British context. In 2019, Oborne abandoned stroke number one, the Con-Socialist Party, and I've just lost where I was now, fuck. He abandoned the Con-Socialist Party, hang on a sec. Oborne would probably deny being a member of the oligarchy he attended a private school, then went to Cambridge University, worked for Rothschild's Bank, eventually becoming the political editor of The Spectator. Oborne's reason for abandoning the Con-Socialist Party was that the Conservatives had become a vehicle for well-drilled fanatics who, like the militant tendency Trotskyists, who've subverted the Labour Party 40 years ago, infiltrate constituency parties in order to deselect MPs who offend doctrinal purity. This seems particularly naive, or spectacularly naive, rather, after the Con-Socialist Party stabbed Margaret Thatcher in the back in the 1990s. Thatcher had attempted to pull the Con-Socialists away from socialism, but as soon as she started to threaten the globalist project by criticising the EU, the Con-Socialists removed her. It doesn't say much for Oburn's political analysis that he was working as a journalist at the time, but he could not see the bigger picture. Even Thatcher's government was weaker than was needed. They failed to take action against the leftist propaganda of the BBC, against the decades in which the Muslim grooming gangs had already been operating, or against the Islamic threats against Salman Rushdie, and they failed to get the UK out of the anti-democratic EU. Ferdinand Mount would probably deny being a member of the oligarchy. Yet in 2012, even he wrote a book entitled The New View, a very British oligarchy about inequality in Britain. Sir William Robert Ferdinand Mount is a writer and columnist for the Sunday Times. He went to Eton School, then to Oxford University. We're seeing a theme here, aren't we? He was head of Margaret Thatcher's policy unit when she was Prime Minister and wrote the party manifesto for the 1983 election. But he soon abandoned Thatcherism and returned to Con-Socialism. And not surprisingly, he is incapable of diagnosing the problem adequately and hence offers no solutions. Mount recommends improved accountability, reinvigorated democracy, more stringent regulation. As one of the reviewers of Sir Ferdinand Mount's book noted, Mount's use of oligarchy is to some extent a provocative conceit, designed to make us look again at how unaccountable the business elite have become. He doesn't seriously argue that I can't read, stroke number 2, that a tight circle of unelected figures run the country, rather that the chief executives of major companies, particularly in the finance industry, have been allowed free rein to shape corporate policies with profound social and economic implications. So Mount's critique was driven not by outrage that democracy is just a puppet theatre put on by the oligarchy. No. Sir Ferdinand Mount was just outraged that the people lower class than him were fabulously wealthy and powerful than he. Corporate leaders, lords, civil servants, journalists, etc. are freely shaping society and the economy, rather than the majority of the common people doing this shaping. And this tight circle of unelected people are the oligarchy. Virtually no MP is put there based on a majority of voters choosing him. Britain's democracy is a sham from top to bottom. Chapter 3.6 Goldstein's Orwell's Warning. Perhaps you are still unconvinced that the oligarchy are hiding in plain sight. If you've read 1984, you know that in the book the enemy of the state is Emmanuel Goldstein, or Stein, whatever you want to call him, a man who never appears, but every day the people are gathered together for their collective 2-minute hate sessions where he is the target. Goldstein in that book is the equivalent of Snowball in Animal Farm. In 1984, one of the crimes of Goldstein is that he published a book that exposes how the state works. The title of Goldstein's book is The Theory and Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism. This book reveals the true totalitarian nature of the dystopian society that the party established. It refers to INGSOC, English Socialism Fabianism, the dominant ideology of Oceania, or however the fuck you pronounce it. I can't be bothered. Anyway, and to the ideologies of neo-Bolshevism and Eurasia and death worship, obliteration of the self, and in East Asia. The three ostensibly opposing ideologies are functionally identical. In the liberal democracies, they didn't need to ban the political revelations of books by Jack London, Robert Michaels, and James Burnham. They just ensure that the public remain unaware of them. The leftist activists and the political class are well aware of them. The oligarchy have such powers of thought control, of gramophone minds, of phrase slaves, that they could put Animal Farm and 1984 on the school syllabus confident that the public won't understand the true meaning. All the millions of Qurans that command Muslims to hate and to kill non-Muslims are allowed to be sold and are to be found in schools. But the oligarchy banned our book, Muhammad's Quran, the only copy of the Quran that denounced all the hatred and violence commanded by that cult. And Tommy Robinson has been subjected to the 2-minute hate by the media in Britain constantly since 2009. But of course the mainstream media won't tell you this. You know the drill, folks, because say it with me. It doesn't suit the narrative. I'm sorry, I just had to get that in there. Anyway, after the riots in the UK in August 2014, Tommy Robinson was blamed for them, although he wasn't even in the country at the time. The blame wasn't attributed to the immigrants or the Quisling police who kneel before the immigrants, nor the 5 decades during which Muslim gangs were permitted to rape English schoolgirls, nor the governments with their 6 decades of population replacement. But as we showed in Chapter 1 in Austria and Germany, women were criminalised for simply speaking the truth about immigration and criminality. Fascist censorship is never far from the surface in liberal democracies. The political class and the news media refuse to allow people like Tommy Robinson to speak or debate, yet the oligarchy blame him anyway for commenting in the few places he can on what the oligarchy has deliberately brought to pass. I'm just going to pause this for a sec. Think about it. If they allowed Tommy Robinson to speak out on some of these things, a lot of the shit the mainstream media would have been debunked. Just like that. That's why they can't have him on. Because they know full well that if Tommy Robinson, as an intellectual that he is right now, was allowed on those platforms and was allowed to actually say some of the things he's saying in this book, the media, the governments, they would be destroyed in an instant. Because he would just be able to destroy them with facts. All they can do is spout out nonsense and say, well, you did this and that and that and this, and even though we can't prove it, you're far right. That's basically what it boils down to. Anywho, where were we? The political class and, for example, when the anti-immigration riots, as they called it, of August 2024 happened, the journalists were blaming Tommy Robinson. This is basically what happened when the Southport riots happened as well, by the way. Even though he wasn't in the country, and when he was commenting on the protests, he was saying he understood the public's anger, but violence wasn't the way to fix them, or fix things. After weeks of falsely accusing him, goldstoning him, by never interviewing him and never repeating what he says without editing it, the journalists have then lamented that Tommy Robinson was 1,348% more famous than before they spent weeks promoting falsely blaming him. It must have been galling for them when a Muslim in Pakistan was arrested and charged with the lies about the Southend stabber that were blamed on the mythical far right. When we first started working on this book, we even considered giving it the title The Theory and Practice of the Oligarchical Collectivism, but we realised the comparison to the character of Emmanuel Goldstein and Orwell's 1984 would be lost on those who think we are elite, or they are elite. Let us now turn to some examples of how the oligarchy in some other countries subject dissidents to the Goldstein treatment. Chapter 3.7 Oligarchy in Israel. When people who are not part of the oligarchy reflect on how the majority of the voters have no control, how the things that are done in our name are not the things we want, we get some glimmer that someone else is in charge. It's not surprising that in the West people blame Jews, since historically Jews have been connected to financial power. They were moneylenders when throughout the history of Europe Christians were often prohibited from doing this. But it's important to note that there were plenty of Christian bankers who were moneylenders. For example, the Medici dynasty in Italy, whose bank was the most powerful bank in Europe. Among the oligarchy in the West, there will be some Jews, just as there will be some Chinese, some atheists, many capitalists, many leftists, some Muslims, and some Christians. The oligarchy are to be found in all institutions of any size, and they form an overlapping network. Their overlapping network spans countries, religions, generations, and even to some extent social classes. There are more connections between the oligarchy in Canada and Greece and Britain and China than there were connections between the common people of Britain and the oligarchy in Britain. Evidence that the oligarchy are not the Jews can be seen in how the oligarchy in Israel treats Jews there who are a threat to the oligarchy. Let us examine the case of Rabbi Kahan. Kahan was an American Jew. He completed multiple degrees, including degrees in law and in international relations, when he then qualified as a rabbi. In the 1960s, he wrote books and articles as a Jew, rallied Jewish support for the Vietnam War, and in 1968 he founded the Jewish Defense League, the JDL. I almost want to say that was in reference to Tommy, but I can't really say that for absolute certain. Anyway, modelled on the idea of Black Power and the Black Panthers. Kahan wanted American Jews to stand up to anti-Semitic violence from black people in America. As we know, the oligarchy ensure that racism from black people is something that's supposed to be a logically impossible fiction, as only white people can be racist. Oh, that is oh so true. In 1971, Kahan moved to Israel, and in the USA he was convicted of conspiracy to manufacture explosives and received a suspended sentence of 5 years. Of course, neither the Britannica article nor the Wikipedia article about Kahan provides any context to Kahan's conspiracy charge, which related to attacks by the JDL on the institutions of the Soviet state, because the Soviet Union refused to allow Jews to leave that bloc. The JDL's harassment of Soviet diplomats, following them in cars, jeering them in streets, and cursing them in Russian, took a violent turn very quickly. On January 8, 1971, a bomb went off in the Social Cultural Building in Washington. This was the JDL's first official operation in the nation's capital and part of Kahan's campaign to tie the cause of Soviet Jewry to militant anti-communism. After the bombing, news agencies received anonymous calls saying, "This is a sample of things to come. Let our people go. Never again." It was a shot across the bow. JDL spokesperson Bertram Zweibon denied the JDL had anything to do with the bombing, but applauded it nonetheless. A classic JDL tactic. Here we are, decades later, and the pearl-clutching liberals of the USA and Europe are supporting the murderous anti-democratic National Socialist coup in Ukraine 2014, and the subsequent years of violent ethnic cleansing of Russian speakers. If the likes of Kahan were today going around harassing Russians in the West, his JDL would be the darlings of the oligarchy. Contrast the actions of Kahan with those of animal rights activists, or the Religion of Peace, who literally murder those they regard as the enemy. Remember, even after the events of the 7th of October 2023, an attack on Israel of greater scale than 9/11, the BBC steadfastly refused to describe the genocidal rapists of Hamas as terrorists. The Soviet Union's official communications in 1970 acknowledged that Kahan's JDL was threatening new acts of violence against Soviet institutions in the USA. While the liberal USA and Europe, the Olympic Committee and Eurovision currently harass and punish individual Russians for being Russian, Kahan's JDL targeted institutions of the Russian state and Russian diplomats. Once Kahan had moved to Israel, it appears that some JDL members did kill some Arabs and suspected National Socialists in the USA. While the terrorist violence of the JDL is what most summary accounts emphasize, often the JDL actions consisted of things like setting off stink bombs during Russian ballet. In 1984, Kahan became a member of parliament in Israel, the elected representative from the party he created, named Kach, K-A-C-H. How did the only democracy in the Middle East respond to an elected Zionist and a rabbi? Kahan was boycotted across the aisles of the Knesset and would often speak in front of an empty chamber. The Israel Broadcasting Authority similarly avoided coverage of his activities. The Central Elections Committee tried to ban Kahan from running in the 1984 elections, but this ban was overturned by the Supreme Court because there was no law to support it. This is stroke number 3. Is this how parliamentary democracy is supposed to work? As we see in Britain, when Andrew Bridgens MP addressed the House of Commons about the dangers of the mRNA vaccine, essentially there was a potential Labour cover-up with the mRNA vaccine potentially causing inflammation of the arteries around the heart, just for a little bit of context there. The debating chamber was virtually empty, with no reporting in the news of his speech. Remember the Iron Heel? Jack London showed this is how the oligarchy behave. In 1985, Kahan was stripped of his American citizenship because he was then a member of parliament in Israel. Kahan challenged that decision in the American courts, and in 1987 appeared to win. Following that court case, in 1988, the Israeli parliament passed a law saying that MPs could only have citizenship of Israel and no other country, which meant Kahan had to then renounce his US citizenship. Kahan later made an unsuccessful legal challenge of his renunciation in the US courts, claiming that the Israeli government had effectively forced him to choose between being an American citizen or being an Israeli politician. This might seem like a pedantic detail, but it will become significant below. In 1988, Kahan returned to the USA, and in 1990, at a speaking engagement in New York, he was assassinated in what has been described as one of the earliest examples of Islamic terrorism in the United States. Interestingly, the Muslim eventually convicted of Kahan's assassination denied at first that he did it. The gunshots were fired by, and I quote, a man disguised as an Orthodox Jew. But some years later, it was reported that this Muslim had confessed to killing Kahan. Indeed, a few years later, after the first Islamic attempt to blow up the World Trade Center in 1993, Kahan JDL Radio frequently broadcast a warning to the people of New York that the FBI was ignoring evidence police found in a New York mosque indicating Muslims were planning a second terrorist attack on the World Trade Center. The JDL were right. I just need to get myself comfortable, bear with me. What is of interest to us is Kahan's persecution at the hands of the oligarchy and the liberal democracy that is Israel. The year that he was assassinated, Kahan wrote a book about democracy and what he had experienced. The book was titled Israel, Revolution or Referendum. The chapters of this book, most important and relevant to us, are those two entitled Democracy and Referendum. Note that the MP, writer, activist, lawyer, and student of international relations has a question mark after the word democracy. And note that the next chapter moves straight on to talk about the referendum, that is, the need for more democracy. Kahan points out how the liberal democracy of Israel has shades of the totalitarian state from Orwell's 1984. When someone is arrested, they are told they can remain silent, but if they do remain silent, the judge says that implies they are guilty of the accusation. Or when the police tell the judge that the evidence against the accused is a secret and neither accused nor his lawyer are permitted to see the evidence. I'm going to say something here as well about staying silent as far as when you are interviewed by police or what have you. You don't have to say anything to the police. Here in Britain in particular, the key words to take when they read you what is akin to an affidavit in the US is anything you can say will may be given in evidence. That's where they try to get you. So when you speak up, they can use that against you in court. You don't have to say anything. That is just them trying to intimidate you to say something, and then they've got you anyway. So in almost every case, whenever you have a police interview, it's always best to keep your mouth shut and just say, no comment. And yes, that was my cleaning cloth from my glasses. Anyway, back to where we were, which was down here. In order to appear that there is some judicial oversight of the Kafkaesque police, the suspect, who should be free, is not remanded for 15 days, but only for 10 days. The police say that bail should be withheld so that they can question the accused further, but on the last day of the remand, the police returned to court to extend it. Having never spoken to the accused again in the time he was remanded, then there was the use of administrative arrest, where the accused is sent to prison for 6 months without benefit of a trial or even knowing what the charge is. After the 6 months are over, the Minister of Defence can sign yet another order for yet another 6 months ad infinitum. Kahanes asserts that Israel only appears to be a democracy, saying it is really democratarian, a totalitarian regime cloaking so much of the trappings of democracy. To the outside world, it's a democracy, but to those who run afoul of its inner system, and especially if they are particular thorns in the side of the government, the stroke number 4. The totalitarian nature is clear. The success of the government in creating this democratarianism is due to the basic fact that Jews wish to believe only the best about the country. They do not want to believe things about it that puncture the illusion Jews so badly need. We would say this does not apply to only Israel. It is a feature of probably all the so-called liberal democracies. Look at what the Netherlands authorities persecuted Geert Wilders. Look at how the EU and the French parliaments would remove legal protection from an MEP or MP, such as Marine Le Pen, who the EU and the French politicians saw as a threat, while ensuring that all other EU and French politicians still had legal immunity. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. Look at what the deep state in the USA has been doing to the billionaire who was its president from 2016 to 2020. And contrast that with how the deep state enabled and concealed the behavior of Hillary Clinton and the Biden family. Look at what Britain has done to Julian Assange, and of course, the non-stop state persecution of Tommy Robinson. And while the Marxist organisation Lives Matter, or maybe I was right first time, were allowed to riot and kill and cause billions of dollars in damage, look at what was done to the protesters of Washington after 6th of January 2021, or the trucker protesters in Canada 2022, aka COVID. The supposed rule of law only exists insofar as it aids the oligarchy. But as in Israel, the vast majority of people cannot bring themselves to believe this. They prefer to believe comforting lies rather than uncomfortable truths. Democracy, a free press, the rule of law, justice, and a political choice are concepts to be bandied about and used in order to consolidate power and crush meaningful opposition. Fascism, basically. But the real word is power. That is what obsesses them. Those who are the authority in Israel, who are the authority in Israel. And as Kahane describes in Israel, so it is elsewhere, the oligarchy includes the left-wing parties and the right-wing parties. Kahane wasn't some communist, he was an anti-communist, even if he sounds like a woke radical. If a political organisation should arise that successfully threatens the power of the oligarchy, the latter will be set about to destroy that new organisation and its leaders. In 1988, the Israeli democracy banned Kahane's party. To these Democrats, even the constitution of a country is to be changed when something that is legal within the constitution threatens their power. The High Court of Israel upheld a Knesset Central Elections Committee ban on the Kach movement running in the Knesset elections. Had it been a pornographic movie, every civil libertarian organisation would have come to its defence. Had a movie or play been banned on the grounds that it was too dangerous to the morals of society, liberal Jewish groups and temples and rabbis would have climbed the ramparts of freedom of speech and expression, demanding that freedom ring even for pornography. Had a radical opposition group with ties to guerrilla movements have been stricken from the ballot in El Salvador, there would be long and loud protests on the part of liberal Jews, clergy and lay. But when the State of Israel, long boasted as the only democracy in the Middle East, bluntly decides that a political party that is already sitting in the Knesset and according to the polls will receive anywhere from 6 to 12 seats, it shall not run. The silence from Jewish liberals is deafening. Remember, the virtue signalling of such liberals exists to distract from the fact that the signallers have no virtue. Any principle can be reversed. Murder becomes legal, provided the murdered person is too young to object, as with abortion. In Britain, the oligarchy barely need to outlaw political parties, as the British electoral system is so corrupt it is effectively a constitutional oligarchy with little pretense of being democratic. See Appendix 8, which shows not how only a minority of voters have been given power to every single government in Britain. Kahane's Kach party won its first seat in the Israeli parliament in 1984, after failing to win a seat in the previous 3 elections. But note well, the oligarchy didn't set out to ban it until the new party looked like it was going to be a threat to their cosy oligarchy. Looking back on the events since Kach was elected to the Knesset in 1984, one is overwhelmed by the sheer hate and trampling of basic rights. One is stunned by the bile, the defamation, the lies, the twisted faces and facts, and of course, all from people who pride themselves on their culture, fair play, democratic tolerance, and intellectual ability to discuss any and all issues scientifically, calmly, and rationally. Yeah, a left-wing politician being all that. Yeah, you've got more chance of me going to the moon in a rocket, but that's shit, let me tell you. But I digress. Their hatred was a poisonous, noxious thing. Their totalitarianism was mind-boggling. Israeli government, television and radio ruled that Meir Kahane, a Knesset member whom they utterly opposed, be therefore not permitted to appear on programs, not to have his statements reported, not to have his press conferences covered. Yellow journalism and blatant deliberate lies abounded, all with intent to smear and defame. Does this not sound like the same treatment meted out to Tommy Robinson? Indeed, something similar has happened in the USA with Donald Trump, where TV stations decided that he was too dangerous to be allowed to speak for himself. Cable network, Broadcast News, and Twitter cut short their broadcasts of President Donald Trump's speech from the White House briefing room Thursday. MSNBC, ABC, CBS, CNBC, and NBC cut away from his speech. It's not the first time networks have opted not to carry Trump's remark live. In March, several ended their live broadcasts of one of their president's briefings. Trump was at that time the elected president of the nation. The Zionist MP Kahane was banned by the government ministries from speaking to students in Israel, although Muslims and communists were not banned from doing so. Moreover, the high schools introduced a compulsory course on Kahanism, which not only was filled with falsehoods, fraud, and bile, but was blatant political brainwashing course that smacked off the totalitarian systems of fascism and communism. Even the Israeli military took to this political indoctrination of the lower ranks. When Kahane would speak in the parliament, all of the other MPs would walk out. This then served as a model for other fascists elsewhere in the international arena, who would walk out whenever official Israelis speak out, the fascists justifying their actions by saying that Israel is a racist state. They follow the example set by how the oligarchy in Israel had treated the Zionist rabbi. The president of Israel welcomed in his residence communist and pro-PLO Arab MKs, members of parliament, and refused to do so with the same of Meir Kahane, a Jewish Zionist Knesset member, and nearly had stroke number 5 there. During the COVID pandemic, Britain's Consocialist Party had avowed communists on the committee that was set up to instill fear into the British public. The oligarchy contains communists as easily as it contains so-called conservatives. The Israeli oligarchy organised thousands of indoctrinated young leftists to attack Kahane's public meetings, just as in Britain, the communist-run group Unite Against Fascism would do to the English Defence League. Remember, one of the founding signatories of this communist group was Lord David Cameron, who attended Eton and Oxford. Some of the Israeli politicians urged the violent indoctrinated youth to kill them, referring to Kahane and his voters. Kahane reports that the newspaper of the Marxist Party in Israel declared the violence on the left against Kahane and his voters was sweet. Kahane was an elected member of their parliament and was even restricted in where he could travel within Israel. The censored MP points out that the Israeli parliament changed the parliamentary rules more than in just 1 year than they had in the previous 36 years that the state of Israel has stroke number 5 the state of Israel had existed. Realizing that everything he said was being dismissed as racist, with no definition of what racist actually meant, one of Kahane's proposals, dismissed by the Speaker of the Parliament as racist, was, unbeknownst to the Speaker, a word-for-word quotation from the great Jewish philosopher Maimonides. I believe that's how it's pronounced. Maimonides? Yeah. This is similar to what happened with Muhammad's Quran. The book was banned as hate speech, when all it did was put the verses of the Quran in the chronological order accepted by scholars. What Kahane showed is that the fascist oligarchy used racist and hate speech to shut down those that they want to have silenced. Exactly the same words can be spoken with no consequence by someone who is approved by the oligarchy. For example, those who believe in the Quran can recite the state-funded mosques recite in state-funded mosques, sorry, my brain had a moment there, the violent hatred that is foundation of Islam, kill the unbelievers, but if someone was to reverse that and publish a book saying kill the Muslims, they would be in prison or would be dead at the hands of Muslims or leftists. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. And that will be all for today's book. But yes, I have tried to pick up the mood a little bit, because obviously speaking about my inner demons, as it were, is quite taxing. There we go. So that's why I was a little bit down in the first couple of minutes of the video. But hey, at least we managed to pick it up, and hey, we've had another 5 strokes, so there you go. I mean, I can find a way to get through this, and don't worry, I will try to find a way to get through what I'm going through right now. But in the meantime, guys, thanks for tuning into this manifesto session, and I am going to wish you all a Merry Christmas, because we will be doing the next one on the 28th of December, and we'll see what wonders we can learn from that one. And I'll probably do a personalized message nearer the time, but yeah, we'll worry about Christmas when it comes along. But I will see you guys in the next one. Bye for now.